architecture, but for tonight, I'm also a member of the College of Architecture and Design's Programming and Events Committee. That committee also included Julie Kress, includes Faye Nixon, and we are chaired by Cathy Dan Zhang. As you've heard, what we did for the series this year was look at a list of allegedly provocative words and find two that were particularly seemingly innocuous in isolation, that were nonetheless important to us from various disciplinary perspectives. One was barriers, the other was historically. And throughout the year and semester, you're seeing various takes on those words, that context, and so on. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend Kai Franz. Giving an introduction to someone you know this well is tricky for obvious reasons. You know, I know too much in a sense. There's a lot I probably should not say and I won't say. But also Kai's persona is intertwined with his work. And knowing him is like experiencing a provocative work of art. That's meant to be a compliment. I don't mean to objectify you like a work of art yet. Kai is an artist who practices in a discipline of his own making. He was born in Cologne and educated in architecture in Germany and then the ETH Zurich. He did a stint at OMA, and then he studied on a Fulbright at RISD in the MFA program in Digital Plus Media. At the time, the plus in the name was key. It wasn't a digital art program, and the best students at the time weren't fully inside digital culture. They were hacking and hybridizing digital media with other cultures and materials, or at least Kai was. But architecture pulled him back in, one of my favorite things to say, or at least the Fulbright pushed him back in. He earned an MArch at Princeton, as one does, and then returned to RISD to teach after serving an artist in residence at the Academy Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart. He's been at RISD for over 10 years, having earned tenure and the rank of associate professor some years ago. At RISD, he teaches spatial dynamics in the division of experimental and foundation studies. I want to contextualize that a little bit. At RISD, that first year, experimental and foundation studies, is a separate department with separate leadership and curriculum and curricular oversight, independent from other units and degrees. At RISD, as a student, you don't start your major until second year. I mention that because Kai's teaching shapes those who teach. Kai's teaching has shaped his students and in turn has shaped him. And being in that intradisciplinary environment, I think very much influenced Kai's practice. Over the years, while I was at RISD, I noticed that his students don't learn anything about architecture. When they came to me in the teaching second year, they didn't know anything. And yet, when they did come to study architecture, they were very ready to do architecture. Some of his students came to second year knowing Rhino because Kai had brought nude figure models into the computer lab to be modeled in Rhino by students who had never opened Rhino before. That's a story I never saw, but just heard about. He was known at RISD for other myths and legends. But I would say he was fundamentally known for teaching students how to live and operate in the world as artists and designers. His studios were strange and highly productive and generous communities. In the world of art and architecture, Kai is well known for his plopper, a machine of 2D bones hacked to be a 3D depositor of sand and resin that is like a digital 3D printer, sort of. His plops have garnered significant attention. In a book containing and about his work called Serial Nature, there's an essay by Martin Beck, an artist and art theorist. I'm going to read you a little excerpt because I like it. The plops not only grind against human excitement about our grand technical ability to construct and fabricate, but also against our belief in our faculty for deep and intense sentiment. From their appearance, the plops seemingly try to look like art, maybe like paintings or objects of abstract expressionism. Their temporality is actually no specific time, but a certain space. The desert as a timeless space that produces nothing, grows nothing, only kills, and reminds everything of its finitude. He also, end quote, he also does not plops. I mean, you put his work into two categories, plops and not plops. I'm particularly excited to hear with you how a practice that is known to have contributed an important polemic on machines, authorship, material, and computation has all along been a practice about identity, place, and humanity. Please join me in welcoming Franz.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Oh,
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Carl. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I've come to believe that everything is performance. Before we construct identity, identity constructs us. One of the most powerful systems that has done this historically is architecture. Not just as buildings, not just buildings as objects, but architecture as scale, orientation, memory, and atmosphere. Here, at the School of Architecture, this construction also includes the discipline itself, how architecture produces not only structures, but architects. My name is Franz. I'm an artist and often a hacker. My work operates at the intersection of art, architecture, and digital culture. I'm interested in how technological systems shape everyday life. Everything I do functions as a mirror, not reflecting what is already there, not reflecting what is already known, but revealing what was already there. I did not set out to make work about architecture and identity. This lecture is part of articulating and discovering that connection, a process of reframing what already exists. Today I want to trace how identity is formed, through structure, through rupture, through dispersal, and through relation. This is one of the first architectures that constructed my sense of scale and permanence. The building exceeds the body, vertically, temporally, spiritually. It produces a subject who feels small, continuous with history, and is positioned inside something larger than themselves. Architecture here stabilizes identity through monumentality. It teaches duration, hierarchy, transcendence. Basilica St. Ursula Golden Chamber. Here, the collective body literally becomes architecture. Human remains are arranged spatially and structurally. Memory is not symbolic, it is material. Identity is constructed through accumulation. Architecture becomes an archive of mortality. Holocaust Memorial Berlin. This architecture destabilizes identity. There is no center, no hierarchy, no stable orientation. Movement produces disorientation. Memory becomes spatial experience. In the distance, behind this field of loss, stands the Reichstag, political power framed by historical trauma. Memory and state identity here coexist in tension. United States Capitol. Here, architecture constructs national identity symbolically, order, symmetry, continuity. The building stages the nation as stable and unified. Architecture becomes a physical narrative of political permanence. And yet, the collective body periodically refuses the stability. Carnival back in Cologne, a temporary suspension of order. Identity becomes fluid, roles dissolve, hierarchies invert. And then ordinary life resumes. The dome and its monumental shadow remains. Structure becomes a background condition. The city reorganizes itself around it, and also in resistance to it. From foundation to relation. Architecture does more than construct national or cultural identity. It shapes how we orient ourselves in the world. Up to now, we have seen identity stabilized through structure. My work begins where stability ends. What happens when identity is produced through process rather than permanence? My training is in architecture, but early on I became interested in computation, not as tools, but as a way of thinking. I began working with generative systems, systems that produce form through relationships rather than fixed design. Architecture shifts here from object to process, from composition to emergence. This project was one of my first fully algorithmic buildings. The system made relative decisions instead of absolute ones. At the time, it felt like a paradigm shift. A critic once asked whether I had considered the building from all of its sides, in its full urban context. I had not. For me, the conceptual framework mattered more than the total image. The model still exists. It lives above my toilet. Architecture did not disappear. It relocated. It became something small, persistent, embedded in everyday life, a residue of a system. Here's an early project of mine from 2012. The Guggenheim, New York is a series of mechanically produced sculptures. A machine I built takes models of canonical buildings and dips these into paint over and over again. I was interested in how this process of additive subtraction, the layering of paint over a highly described form, achieves a decay of form while also leading to a new formal language. Additionally, I'm searching for the moment when the object changes its medium condition, when the structure becomes residue, when form loses control over material. This is the first moment where architecture begins dissolving. All of these works problematize issues of scale. As models, the pieces exist on a 1 to 200 scale, yet as objects, they also exist on a 1 to 1 scale. The material properties of paint, together with the physical resistance of gravity, room temperature, humidity, make the process unscalable, bound to the 1 to 1. These pieces thus collapse from being distinctly in the realm of architecture and art into a mutual medium condition, a 1 to 200 to 1 to 1 scale, that superimposes the representational with the actual object nature within one thing. It is of course no coincidence that the object under attack here is the Guggenheim. No building has ever narrated the continuum of progress and apotheosis of modernism as well as this one. My gesture, the dip, stays repetitive and insists, much like the continuous white wall of the actual museum, ascending and expanding in upward motion. However, the iterative nature of the process, the repetitive dipping into paint, ultimately captures an entirely different position. Machine as mode and medium. For tonight's lecture, I went back to my thesis statement and I wanted to read some excerpts to contextualize the project. Architecture has reached an imminent state of high resolution. This project proposes an alternative methodology for a new resolution in architecture, away from overdetermined high-res to a new low-res architecture that operates within the grain of computation and activates the will of matter. In our discipline, we establish formal regularity, we define this precision and perfection to be the norm. I want to make clear from the very beginning that resolution in architecture, for me, is not about formal definition or geometric complexity, but rather rooted in determination and issues around scale. With the fetishization of the crisp impeccable, architecture has grown to a totalizing state of control and perfection. BIM models, 2D, 3D rendering, softwares, and contemporary numeric controlling increasingly feed our desire to determine and describe everything. In the end, we use all available technology towards one end. The seemingly high-res forces the material manifestations to work against their nature. Or, to put it differently, our discipline has produced a model in which planning and design are smart and agitated, and execution remains dumb and still. In this approach to low-res architecture, design determination is shifted into the realm of execution. Planning, design, and implementation become subject to material osmosis, a methodology that utilizes the physical scale of materials, their behaviors, gravity and imperfection, control and chance, all as means to design. In low-res architecture, the role of resolution and control become immediate and necessary collaborators. The rule set of the process, here almost entirely mechanized, at times material, at other times immaterially rooted in the logic of computation, is innately dependent upon increment, scale, and dimension. Low-resolution architecture has an arbitrariness that feels awkward, as it comes neither from the composed basis of architectural form, the legacy of composition and painting, nor the simple haphazard randomness of an event, the mess on a table after a dinner party. Instead, it feels at moments awkwardly casual. In the following slides, I will juxtapose my artist statement with some images of recent works. Plopper, dual-axis position-to-position system, is a machine I constructed to make art objects. I like to think of the plopper as something like the bad conscience of formal idealism, a kind of low-res 3D printer that translates the smart, trim, generally wonderful numbers, points, lines, and algorithms into the thick, vicious, cumbersome, and opaque realm in the nexus of matter and reality. For the last 14 years, I've been working on a body that is centered around this machine. The machine primarily fabricates sculptures, but occasionally also produces prints, drawings, and films. The sculptures begin as drawings created with computer-aided design software that are then fabricated through a custom computer-aided manufacturing process. The plopper, a hijacked architectural plotter, first deposits sand, then it drops resin onto the landscape of sand, building the sculptures layer by layer, while the plopper's input, virtual 3D models and CAD drawings, are regulated by control, precision, and perfection. The machine utilizes chance and imperfection and the will of matter in an effort to overcome determination. Instead of drawing lines, the machine deposits sand and resin. The drawing is only a suggestion. Gravity, viscosity, timing, resistance shape the final form. Material becomes a collaborator. The object is not designed, it emerges. What fascinates me is the gap between the virtual instruction and the physical reality. Forms appear that were never drawn. Identity here is not planned, it is produced. The form is not fully authored, it emerges through interaction. Human identity is produced in the same way, through an ongoing interaction with conditions we do not fully control. Sometimes I think of the plops as alien spit, a reference to their serial nature, futuristic characteristic, and loose geometric qualities. Simultaneously, the works also read as remnants of some long-diseased civilization, as archaeological relics, or as artifacts retrieved from the bottom of the ocean. I'm interested in these temporal vectors of the work. How do we reconcile them in this current moment on time? The title for my last solo exhibition at the Bell Gallery at Brown University in 2017, While Still Before Us After All, was an attempt to highlight and foreground this contradictory temporal dimension of the work. It was also an effort to render the work visible as an acceleration of today, as a dark residue of our current culture and technologically determined existence. And yet, for me, these works also search for an alternative of what it might mean to coexist, horizontally, in equilibrium. Here's an image of the installation of the exhibition showing a video alongside two different plots. My work often exists inside architectural systems, but resists their logic. The exhibition took place in a building that was designed by iconic American modernist architect Philip Johnson. The conversation between the brutalist architecture of the building and my work seemed rich, materially and tectonically. Architecture here stabilizes, material destabilizes. That tension is central. I will now go back to the beginning of the project and cast some light on the process and explain some of the technicalities of the work. The work with dual-axis position-to-position system, or plopper, began as part of my thesis in Princeton. I appropriated a large format printer from the school and physically hacked and converted it. And so the plotter became a plopper. Here you see the machine in its first iteration back in 2012. I added these arms to the plotter, lifted the axis of the print head so that it could freely maneuver to every point on a two-dimensional plane. What originally fed the paper through the machine now moved a wooden bed. These are the deposition heads, a cup holder and a funnel. It was important to me to stay rather ad hoc in the design. The machine deposits sand, creating what I would call a serialized landscape. The machine then drops polyurethane resin onto the landscape. Where the resin hits the sand, it sinks in and freezes the form. Materially, I'm interested in how this hybrid condition, a strange composite, resin and sand, inorganic matter, an eroded landscape adhered by plastic. Here you can see how the plop is removed from the bed after the polyurethane freezes the sand formations. Aesthetically, these initial plots gave me pause. The work seemed as concrete as they were abstract, I thought. Is this concrete abstraction? I would ask today. The indeterminacy of these objects was something that struck me. The underlying serial nature, irrespective of their formlessness. To me, the works read almost absurd or surreal. Yet, their surrealism, I found, was also immediately nullified by their concreteness, not to mention their superficial origin. One thing I want to point out here is the discrepancy of the work in its virtual state vis-à-vis its physical state. All of these little fingers and arms are not actually part of the drawing. These only emerge in the fabrication process. In this series, I plopped the same drawing 8 times under the following conditions. For each production, the scale was changed, ranging from 1 to 50 to 1 to 1,000. 1 to 2,000. The cat drawing was scaled without loss of clarity or information. No abstraction was made. There is something Dada-esque to this understanding of scale. I started to use color because I wanted to place the work more directly in the discourse of painting and abstract expressionism. This work I classified as a calibration piece, where the machine language becomes legible. Differences in line quality from horizontal over diagonal to vertical directly reflect the body of the machine. And the machine is, of course, an extension of my body. Other works, like this one, manufacture total abstractions, where the complexity didn't allow to read the machine languages clearly. This is the same drawing produced twice. The use of color for me shifted the work. I felt a loss of authenticity. The works became more flat, decorative. Today, the relationship of performance and authenticity is one that is central to me and that I playfully seek out and celebrate. At RISD, I like to integrate technologies into my courses in unorthodox ways so that students immediately question and challenge the meaning of and use of a particular software or technology. When I introduce Rhino, I usually give a brief 50 minutes introduction to the user interface and the program's functionality, and then I bring in a live model to continue with 3D modeling from observation. I give instructions that sit somewhere between a software tutorial and a classical live drawing session. Create a new layer, draw a random shape, use the copy tool to work out the shading. This playful and in certain ways impossible task that the students are confronted with instantaneously challenges the underlying mathematical bones of the software and its working environment. There is an element of Dada in this approach to technology in this assignment that is also present in my own work. Eventually, I became a bit skeptical that the plopper seemed to be producing a kind of medium-specific body of work, almost in a modernist fashion. A plopper, being a printmaker, was an attempt to challenge this. Instead of fabricating low-relief sculptures, the machine now drags an etching needle over a copper plate, once tied with a shoelace, and another time the needle is attached with a wire. I then follow a traditional printmaking process where the plate is submerged in an acid bath and is printed on a press. The results are these two prints. In both cases, the same cat drawing, a nude drawing of a human form, is fed into the machine. The left shows the print when the needle was attached with a lace, the right one when it was attached with a wire. Within all of these works, I was interested in questioning notions of authorship. For me, to create the drawing or seed was operating in opposition to this. I would remain the author throughout. It also seemed old-fashioned because the work would follow a lineage from idea over sketch or drawing and making to object or plop. The CAD compositions for this piece reference test patterns and structural compositions appropriated from common 3D printing paths. This piece, for me a seminal work, I use different types of sand. Another attempt to undermine the authority of the drawing. Here, the CAD drawing is exposed to virtual gravity in a computer simulation prior to fabrication. I was inspired by the analog process, by the material process. In a kind of for-loop fashion, I tried to replicate what was happening in the physical state of the work in the digital condition, using the same logic for its distortion, gravity, and material behavior. Only this time, it was simulated. Random drawings exposed to virtual gravity. Lump. Lump as particle carcass. Perlin noise is a type of procedural gradient noise used to increase the appearance of realism in computer graphics. The function has a pseudo-random appearance. Synthetic textures using Perlin noise are used in CGI to make computer-generated visual elements appear more natural. Objects of application include surfaces, fire, smoke, clouds, but also terrain and vegetation. By now, these images have become ubiquitous. In certain ways, they are the very grain of computation's idea of nature. The formation for the sand landscape in this work is determined by a Perlin algorithm. In this piece, I was interested in taking this digital procedure, used to emulate nature, and returning it to the physical realm. This image shows the moment the plop resurrects from the ground. What is left behind? The shadow of the work, an interplay of presence and absence. Another aspect of this is the fragility of these works. Whenever I handle them, I have sand traces on my hands. I like this ephemerality and the instability. This is the most recent version of the plopper in my studio. I built this one specifically to make large-scale monumental plops. This is one of them, 7 by 12 feet, 1 foot deep, about 600 pounds heavy. I wanted to push the work to its limits. When lifting it from the ground, the piece collapsed under its own weight. I love how the two fragments sit together. Algorithms and expectations. Science experienced a revolution in the 1970s when bottom-up thinking challenged its basic methodologies, away from hypotheses that rests in approval or disapproval towards the effects of emergence. Cellular automata are one example of this. They have been studied immensely by Wolfram. The simplest type of cellular automaton is a binary, nearest neighbor, one-dimensional automaton. In a given row of cells, cells can either be on or off, 0 or 1, black or white, dead or alive. Based on the neighboring 3 cells, the system will then determine whether or not the cell in the next generation, here highlighted in gray, will be alive. This would be an example of a rule set. We see that if all cells are alive, the cell would be dead. If only the cell on the left is alive, then the cell would also be alive, etc. This is the result from a single cell that is active, a field of growth, of patterns, generative in nature. If the combinatory rule set is changed, an entirely different pattern will emerge. Conway's game of life does this on a 2-dimensional plane or grid. Here, the neighboring cells will determine if a cell is alive in the next generation. Certain configurations stabilize, others pulse, some persist, some repeat. These are called still lives and oscillators. They are not objects in the traditional sense. They are events, patterns, temporarily holding themselves together. They emerge without intention, without authorship, without design. They are what the system does when it simply is allowed to run. Themes of emergence and the relationship of encoded information and instruction run throughout my work. History of one organism is what I would call an algorithmic painting. The act of painting here is dumbed down. Deprived of human agency in the execution of this work, I drop spoonfuls of paint onto a wooden board. I literally reenact the game of life following the instructions of a computation of the 1970 game of life. For every cell that's alive, I drop 1 spoon of house paint. When the generation is complete, the paint dries. Afterwards, I complete the next generation. What takes seconds to compute takes me many months to execute. To paint via this process means to manage paint. The question is no longer what or how to paint, but maybe how to cope with paint. 2015 to 16. These 4 works that you can see here form another series of similar algorithmic paintings. All 4 are reenactments of Cormier's Game of Life again. All 4 have the same initial starting condition. Their diagrams are identical. However, you can see that the orientation on different angles in space. For me, this was an effort to acknowledge and simultaneously overcome gravity as a totalizing force and condition. It is something I took from the gravity simulations I showed earlier. This captures the gesture, a careful drop, deprived of agency. The size of these works is calibrated to the human body, 4 feet square. Each work consists of over 20,000 drops. Duration and the impact on the everyday life. These series took about 18 months to complete. And then the final works. The normalizing gesture, when I hang them vertically, is important to me. Simple rules produce complex outcomes. Identical starting conditions, different results. Identical diagrams, different results. Orientation changes everything. Identity becomes emergent rather than fixed. The titles indicate the vector of the grid, the orientation of the board in space. Keep Smiling is the outlier. With a bit of black humor, I chose this title to allude to the endurance of the work. It also was a silly way to entertain myself and maintain sanity. I chose this particular pattern or cumulative composition, at least in part, because I noticed and liked the grotesque-like, clown-like smiling face in the negative space of the work. It was also somewhat a friendly smile at the critic I referred to in my first slide. Did I consider it from all of its sides? In 2018 to 19, I completed another series of Game of Life paintings. This time, they were matte black. A decision that seemed somewhat counterintuitive. Maybe I did this because it seemed like a digital move, like changing the color of a shape in Illustrator. I liked it precisely because it was a step sideways and not forward. Imagining the black and the white paintings next to each other, it was indeed also a wink at the binary determinism that inspired me to make this work. Why are we so drawn to exactitude, classification, and categorization? Then the institutional space disappeared. Studio disappeared. Exhibition disappeared. Production disappeared. For me, it did not make sense to continue working in the same way. My art practice sat. I stopped making. Identity reorganized elsewhere. I began making costumes with my mother. Carnival, ritual, embodiment became central. This also coincided with the birth of my daughter, Caspar. Identity moved from system to relation, from production to care. When it shifted to making costumes, I started to play with the carnivalesque. Inhabiting the ephemeral and the performative felt freeing. Now I want to show you what happens when structure itself begins to dissolve. What you will see next is not chronological. It's not narrative. We will move backward. Please don't try to interpret each image. Just watch what happens to identity as it disperses. In 2022, I became a turkey. Wearing a costume is always rooted in the rigging of one's own identity. It is an homage to the unconsciousness. It gives agency to misbehave, to overcome the confines of one's own performance of self and authenticity in everyday life. Every costume does this. I will now show images that are AI-generated extrapolations of my turkey costume. The system produces variations that extend the human body beyond its original form. What happens when identity can multiply faster than it can stabilize? The sequence begins at the beginning, but moves away from its origin. These slides are about holding together before drifting apart. Identity begins as something shared, something held together. But even what gathers can spread. Baldwin said, "Go towards what you fear." Identity becomes framed. The collective begins to differentiate. Hetero-queer, calamari. Hacker, other. Experience is structured by systems. Some identities expand beyond familiar categories, biological, social, even beyond human. Identity detaches from national structure. Instability becomes explicit. Identity moves beyond human classification, like otherkin. The American turkey. Categories begin to multiply. Calamari. Hetero-queer hippie. No more German. The self becomes a composite. Roles, categories, boundaries begin to blur. Hetero-calamari queer. Identity no longer holds together as one. no longer gathers around a center. Human and non-human. Beyond human. This is where I am now. Identity is dispersed. The work that follows is what happens after dispersion. These are practices that don't represent identity, they reorganize it. Relational reconstruction. The next project is a collaborative project with Andrew Zhang. We started to make furry phones from old cases. These objects began as simple phone covers, fur placed around them. But very quickly, they began to change behavior. People held their phones differently, touched them differently, carried them differently. The device begins to acquire a presence. The device became less instrumental and more companionate. Interaction became tactile, affective, relational. Identity is shaped not only by structures, but by how we touch and are touched. These are small relational architectures. Interaction changes, perception becomes mediated through touch. The first time I took a photograph with one of them, something unexpected happened. The image was slightly blurred, soft, unstable. It almost looked AI generated. In that moment, I suddenly became aware of something I had never noticed before. My own name contains KI, künstliche Intelligenz, and AI, artificial intelligence. For a second, I couldn't tell where the image was coming from, the material, the device, the algorithm, or me. It took my breath away. That was a moment of recognition, not of technology, but of entanglement. Identity is no longer something separate from our tools. It is formed through them. The blur was the moment the device stopped being a tool and became a companion. Perception was no longer mine alone. It was shared, entangled, alive. And once relation became real, it begins to organize itself. That organization became the institute for involvement beyond acceptance. Andrew and I formed the Institute. It is not an organization. It is an experiment in how identity can be formed collectively. The Institute for Involvement Beyond Acceptance marks a shift. Acceptance is passive. It recognizes difference. Involvement is active. It participates in difference. Identity is no longer simply acknowledged. It is co-produced through participation. This is an institutional experiment in relational identity formation. We also covered our iPads and computers. We also created covers for iPads and computers. Next month, we'll be holding a hands-on workshop at RISD to teach people how to convert their own phones into companions. Quietly, I'm wondering if this might become a larger movement. If involvement is real, it cannot remain abstract. It has to take form. It has to take presence. The question becomes, what does relational technology look like when it is embodied? I thought, if I do this to my phones, I should probably do it to myself as well. I trimmed my nails, I photographed them from atop, I drew them in CAD, and I laser cut fur to soften and extend and blur my fingernails. Relational reconstruction. The Institute proposes relation. The following project performs it. What you see here are ESA cameras. ESA stands for Emotional Support Apparatus. They are technological guardians. They observe, they accompany, they witness, but they do not monitor. Built from surveillance devices, home security cameras, but transformed into entities that provide presence rather than control. They are emotional support entities, technological guardians designed to witness, accompany, and to care. In most technological systems, observation flows in one direction. We are watched, we are measured, we are recorded. ESA reverses that structure. These devices do not extract information, they exist to remain with us. They are deliberately constructed as companions, soft, present, responsive, not hidden, not neutral, never invisible. To be witnessed changes how existence is experienced. Presence becomes shared, attention becomes mutual. The ESA cameras materialize the idea of technology, the idea that technology is not outside of us, but that it participates in how we exist. If the popper reconfigures industrial fabrication into collaborative sedimentation process, the ESA works reconfigure domestic surveillance into a practice of technological guardianship. ESA cameras explore what happens when technology is allowed to accompany rather than dominate. They are experiments in relational technology. I will read an excerpt from the ESA certificate on the left. This emotional support apparatus has been designated to provide ambient, emotional regulation, diffuse attention, and unconditional observation. Through persistent presence and non-judgmental recording, the apparatus assists its human counterpart in navigating psychic turbulences, creative uncertainty, and the oscillations between solitude and collectivity inherent to artistic practice. And from the letter of therapeutic acknowledgement on the right-hand side, the letter that I received from my therapist, this letter is to acknowledge that Mr. Kai Franz, under my professional care, has, through our sessions, explored the use of certain technological objects specifically a set of home surveillance cameras as part of his creative and emotional regulation practices. While these devices are not living animals and therefore do not qualify as emotional support animals, under federal regulation or state definitions, Mr. Franz has found them to provide a stabilizing, comforting, and reflective presence within his environment and his artistic process. In our work together, we have discussed these devices and cameras as emotional support apparatuses, non-human companions that participate symbolically and materially in the process of observation, grounding, and creative continuity. The ESA cameras explore what happens when technology participates in relational presence, but relational identity is not limited to technological systems. It also operates at the scale of human life, in how identity is formed, recognized, and named. If relation can be technologically embodied, it can also be biologically lived. Relational identity at the scale of human life. The naming of a child is one of the most powerful acts of identity construction. A name precedes the person who will inhabit it. It establishes orientation before experience exists. In this case, the naming process was collective. Identity was not assigned, it was negotiated, projected, and formed through relation. The current legal name of my son is I would prefer not to. This is not his nickname, it is his legal name. A name that refuses the demands to stabilize identity, a name that resists administrative certainty, a name that introduces hesitation into a system that requires definition. Identity here is not declared, it remains open. Naming becomes an architectural act, a structuring of possibility rather than fixing of form. In everyday life we call him Lux, and we are currently in the process of changing his legal name to Lux Franz. Identity is not assigned once, it is revised, renegotiated, reformed. The gesture of naming and renaming is a gesture of construction and deconstruction. Identity is not fixed architecture, it's ongoing performance and ongoing renovation. It is lived and constructed. We began with architecture, with structures that appear permanent, stable, authoritative, cathedrals, monuments, institutions. Architecture has long functioned as a technology for stabilizing identity, collective identity, national identity, historical identity. But as we moved through these works, stability began to loosen. Material processes resisted control. Forms emerged that were never fully designed. System multiplied identity faster than it could control and stabilize. Perception itself became mediated, relational, entangled. Institutional structures were reimagined, not as frameworks for classification, but as frameworks for involvement. Technology shifted from monitoring to accompanying, from instrument to companion. And at the most intimate scale, identity itself became something enacted, negotiated, revised, named, unnamed, renamed. What emerges across all these scales is a different understanding of construction. Construction is not the production of stable form. It is the ongoing organization of relation. Architecture does not simply build structures. It organizes conditions under which identity can appear, shift, and be sustained. Identity, like architecture, is never complete. It is performed, it is revised, it is inhabited, it is maintained. It undergoes continuous renovation. It is a dynamic field shaped by materials, technologies, institutions, bodies, and relations. Architecture and identity are not separate domains. They are different scales of the same process. Both attempt to stabilize what is fundamentally in motion. Both produce temporary coherence with an ongoing change. If architecture once promised permanence, perhaps it must learn to support transformation. Architecture and the construction of identity is not a completed project. It is an ongoing performance and an ongoing renovation. Thank you.
As a reminder, when we do questions, thank you, Kai. I'm going to pass the microphone around, not for acoustics in here only, but for the archival recording. I'll do a warm-up question.
An easy one? That's good.
No,
I like it.
Given your artistic expertise about emotional support in general, and something you mentioned in our class this morning, I believe to Emily, was about like accidental simulation. Like what if this was a simulation? And okay, so I'm putting it in that context. What would you advise me if I said to you I'm going to start dating an artificial intelligence? I was trying to think of a Kai appropriate question.
Okay.
Like,
I know luck. A lot. I mean, I try not to discriminate. You know, if I am AI, then of course I would be. I mean,
you okay with this? I'm not.
You're
not
okay with it, or you're not doing that? Now
I'm not doing that. Correct. Yes.
Carl is engaged.
Yeah, to a real person, a human. Yeah.
Human.
Yeah. So more context.
Okay.
Like we talk about AI in our world because we live in the world. So you seem to be kind of approaching it very. Even the slideshow was an interlude, right? Like it's a little bit on the margins. Like you've brought it into your practice, but not integrated it into your practice. Can you talk about your attitudes about AI, maybe just in your studio at RISD or in your practice, your comfort level with a kind of, you've got game of life on one hand, a totally known and solved and controllable simulation, and then you've got generative AI as a kind of essentially black box?
I think, well, within the institution, I think at RISD, at the beginning, there were people who were scared about it. And generally, I don't feel the same way. I'm not scared. It's kind of like, I feel like oftentimes comes with maybe like a death feeling, like I will be erased. Mm-hmm. Especially, I don't know, in the liberal arts, people feel like that. Now they're all going to write their papers with AI, and they're going to write, I can't even tell, detect it, and therefore I become redundant. Like, why did I get a PhD? If AI now does, like, you do better now at doing the same work, I don't know. For me, that's kind of exciting. I generally think of like AI in the same way that I think of any technology. It's an extension of us. I try not to other in general, but also to that. Try not to discriminate, try to celebrate. I do also think maybe some of the concerns are valid. I mean, we see my teaching engages a lot of this crisis of embodied experience that we see. Like we're on our phones so much, we engage the flatness of a screen, we experience the world through an algorithmic dimension. To my students on the first day of class, I usually make a joke and say, the internet tells me you guys don't have sex anymore, and even if you do, it's probably filtered by an algorithm. So now I lost my train of thought, but I have never been on any of these apps. That's the other funny part about it. But yes, soon.
Okay, other questions to rescue Kai?
Yeah, rescue me. Last year there was a student review, and I accused the student of not having used AI, and the students were like, "What?"
Yes, thank you, Kai, for such a nice look at the work, and it's all fascinating, and it was great to hear you talk about all the projects, so thank you. I was I don't want to be redundant, but you had me thinking throughout the whole thing about the terms artificial and intelligence. So like, I'm supposed to be afraid of artificial intelligence for all these reasons, but the term out of the two, the one that I'm supposed to be suspicious of is intelligence.
Yeah.
But I find myself being way more suspicious about the first one, which is artificial.
Yeah.
And I see you imbuing intelligence into things through just, affixing a feather to it, for example, or, peeling out algorithmic processes and having human labor conduct those processes. That's the paint, the spooning of the paint. And I'm just kind of wondering about the smear there between intelligence across the processes, and what affordances you have for artificiality across those.
It's a great question. Thank you. I think for me, I think at the time, like the paint droppings, they were supposed to be kind of like in relationship to the plopper, which is this machine that makes the work, right? And so in here, it was a little bit of a reversal, where I become the kind of like machine that executes. In some ways, it was also very simple. Like it didn't make sense to build that as a machine, because the machine that takes like 18 months to make one painting is like an airplane that's on the ground. Nobody wants that, it makes no sense to build a machine for that purpose. Does that make sense? Like it was more logical for me to do it by hand in some ways, just because the drying times are so much. And then, of course, you think about time and in relationship to the everyday life and stuff like that. And I was interested in the qualities of reenacting, right? Kind of embodying an algorithm, doing it. In some ways, it's a meditation, the process of doing that. In some ways, it's also, of course, a commentary on painting, and maybe a shift and what it means to be an artist today, so demystifying that, but it's simple house paint, a wooden board. But I think also you're right to point out that, embodiment is a different form of intelligence as well. And so I never thought about it in that way at the time, I would say. I think the most central for that one for me is actually kind of like a collective way of being and thinking. So with the plopper, but it's initially in the kind of context of architecture, I always talked about it in relationship to authorship and relationship to the tools maybe. But, at the heart of it, it was a kind of like basically a working with the materials. It's as much nature as it is technology, and it's kind of finding a different equilibrium, kind of like existence, a coexistence between all of these vectors that sits without a human presence that is like very dominant, if that makes sense. And so I think later on in the kind of like second half of the talk, maybe what I try to do in the last couple of years is take the learnings from the plopper and superimpose them onto my existence as a human being in the world, taking those learnings, literally trying to live like a plopper. And what it results in is a little bit this blurring of art and life that we see here, but it also results in kind of like thinking about the moment, right? The plops, in part, they freeze this moment in time. The material properties together with me, the machine, humidity, all of those things, boom. This is it, and it's like a snippet of that. It becomes a residue afterwards. This is, I think, why they read so kind of like dead, but also, they're all about life. And in part, I think one of the ways I came out of that was to approach working with other humans in that way. So like Andrew, for example, is a former student of mine, I was saying over lunch, and it's looking for a shared, maybe intelligence, foregrounding collective subjectivities, maybe. Sorry, it was a long answer, sorry.
Maybe as a follow-up to your answer, are you a plopped architect? Do you care about being an architect? Is an architect an interesting identity? Are you an architect?
I don't know if I can still call myself that, like legitimately, and it's of course a question that was for me very present, when I was a student. I went to RISD, studied art on a Fulbright, I was confused after that. I didn't know if I want to like pursue architecture or art. You know, it allowed me to like digest a lot of the architectural education at ETH and RWTH Aachen in Germany, the technical architecture education that was like very expansive and very conceptual, but also very technical. And so the kind of studying art allowed me to, you know, digest some of these experiences, but ask broader philosophical questions. Then I go to Princeton, and now I'm like definitely not sure if I'm architect or artist. And I start to plop, you know, and they're like, well, it's like kind of like very anti-architectural thesis, you know, and so I never turned my back to architecture, but I also, you know, I don't build, not as architects need to build, but, you know, I think I feel a little bit too distant from it, but, you know, my dad still says, like, why do you throw this great education away? You know, you studied architecture, and he comes from a background of like HVAC systems. You know, he's like designing HVAC systems. So like for him, the art stuff is just like too intelligent. You know, it's like slips through his fingers, and he's just like can't believe it. You know.
Hi, thank you again for the presentation. At some point towards the end, you mentioned that identity, I don't know if I framed this right, is like a temporary coherence. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, at which point do you feel that your work has reached that temporary coherence that you can kind of like be done with it, I guess? And I'm wondering if you would ever explore like the dissolution of that product and see how that might itself transform and what that might, I don't know, what kind of information you might convey from that kind of transformation and the self.
That's a great question. I think, you know, I was saying earlier during lunch with the plops, like one of the interesting things that to me I didn't expect was that most plops work formally. Like, you know, initially I thought I would make them and there would be more of recycling or throwing out, like testing out the drawing, seeing what compositions work and what don't work. But the truth is, like, most of them work. And I think it's simply because it uses so much nature, you know, and then they become like trees or clouds, and it's kind of hard to call them ugly. You know, there's something about that which I found fascinating, you know, that a machine does that, and that even though I see them as art, they're always like, let's say, beautiful. I think when the plop is done, that's one of those moments of coherence, you know, and in some ways, the art practice, you know, kind of moved them into the gallery and tried to adhere that a little bit. I think at some point I also was fed up with that. I was kind of like, I felt like there was too much of a focus on art objects, and somehow these objects as residue didn't do enough justice to speak to the aliveness of like what's happening in the studio maybe. And so, you know, at this, like, or another question maybe related is the colored plops, for example. Like, the first time I did them, you know, I was trying to have the conversation with art, with painting. And I felt like the work didn't ask any more serious questions. Maybe it didn't have to. You know, back then I was kind of like, I felt like it was losing some depth. And now I'm like, I'm more interested in that, the performance of that, of these things. I mean, you know, so there's many things I want to do, one of them being like painting plops. I have done a little bit, but I want to explore that more. Bringing the carnivalesque now back into those works, making fur for the plops, or...
Have you considered putting them outside, letting things like grow through them, or in water?
Yeah, actually, yes. So what I have done also is exhibit them kind of like broken and a little bit like in sand in exhibitions. Now, 2 exhibitions I want to do, and they're supposed to be kind of like, I'm going to give this away, but fictional exhibitions. One is like staged at a residency at Schloss Solitude in Germany. And there's this like Baroque castle, and I want to do an exhibition where the plops are in the ground. So kind of digging them out, but it's whether or not they are actually in the ground will be unclear. You know, it's just more like staging it. And then the other part is also, I have like a whole storage unit full of art. And, you know, some of those works are like giant, like those are beasts. You know, it's like 5-6 people need to carry that, and it's heavy. And I was thinking, I contacted the gallery in Portugal, and I asked if we can do a solo exhibition, if I could like put the work in the ocean, and then I think maybe eventually we'll get there on the other side. You know, so gestures, they are about like thinking about the maybe stability, ephemerality, but also, yeah, other things as well. So, you know, but then it's like, now I have to get a boat that can carry like a ton, literally like 1 ton out there, and then probably it's like illegal or something. But yeah.
I would love to see that.
Yeah?
I had this question probably. That piece would solve my question. So I find one of the lines that you sort of said is very provocative, that drawings are suggestions. I really loved that. I was also trying to see the through line among your works from the plopper to the emotional companion surveillance camera. I find myself thinking about your plopper sculpture paintings like recordings of the behavior of the material, of the fluid nature of these material. I find them myself understanding them as part of the recordings of like they're recordings to me. And then we're seeing these kind of recordings that I assume this would be a recording of one of the surveillance cameras seeing through the feathers or something.
Yes.
I'm curious about what's the noise, like what's the accidents, like what would be, because we're still seeing someone being recorded.
Yeah.
And it is still unsettling. Like it is still a surveillance kind of scene. So I'm curious to hear. I mean, it's still a surveillance kind of scene that is being. Yeah. So I'm curious about, like, what's the disruption and how would we understand this type of recording versus the recording of accidents?
Yeah. So this project is maybe like going on for the last like 4 or 5 months, something like that I started to use those. I think that, you know, for this one, I try to choose a conservative thing because maybe it's like new. Also, I didn't feel like the necessity to kind of like transgress here in any kind of way or something like that. But I think that the project, of course, you know, has the ability for that. Like, so in part, I think, you know, it's also in some ways an homage to the Bruce Nauman pieces in the studio, the recordings. So you're probably familiar with those, where he installed like cameras in the studio, and it's about recording what happens in the studio, like the rat runs around and stuff like that, and it's at night vision, you know. And so in some ways it's an homage. They're also different. These are AI-controlled cameras. They have AI face tracking. The very first time I installed them in my studio, you know, I set it up and I slept in my studio because my wife and I had a kind of not good night. And I sleep in there, and I wake up the next morning, and I get a text message from a friend. And so I get up half naked, and I'm standing there reading the text message from a friend. And then I get a notification that says, loitering activity in the space. My life loitering. Somebody's in there loitering, you know. And I was just like, I couldn't believe it, but it was like such a beautiful moment, you know, this kind of like, I was like still maybe half asleep, didn't realize that I was seen. And, you know, so that doesn't maybe fully answer your question, but, you know, part of it is like, I'm not so sure with what to do with the footage yet of it. Part of it is also there's moments of video archonchi, where like things happen in the studio that, you know, are, very corporeal and, you know, embodied and stuff like that. There's moments, in the summer I open these doors and I like kind of like try to let in like others, like moths and stuff like that, kind of come into the studio, and then it started to become about this like boundary of inside and outside a little bit, personal and private. You know, the whole project with the surveillance cameras actually started, I was at a play date with my 6-year-old daughter, and me and other dad are drinking red wine in the living room, and the girls are in the playroom, and then he says, let's check on the girls, and I'm like, sure, and I get up, and he's like, no, stay seated, and he gets his phone out and has a camera in the playroom watching, and then turns it on and has sound, and I was just like, you know. I specifically, we bought a baby monitor that doesn't have video, and we paid more for that so that the kid would be, you know, wouldn't be constantly exposed to this gaze. And I was like, kind of weird, you know, and I liked them a lot, this other dad, you know, so I was like, well, maybe, you know, it's like, I need to rethink about this. And I was like, maybe it's not cool to like spy on others, but like spying on yourself is probably fine, you know, in this culture of consent. And so then I bought 4 of those and installed them in the studio. And then later, you know, you have the phone case, and then you like have this fur, and you're like, oh, like the phone case, by penetrating the boundary, like you can see here, that's like blue tape kind of on the camera lens. That's important to me as a kind of like poking in and rupturing that a little bit. I think there was another question that I'm forgetting. So yeah, part of it is like, it produces more content than life. There's 4 cameras. I can never revisit this material. It also, there's of course this idea also, maybe I would put it on the website and it's constantly there, you know, or maybe there's at times I can like check it in and say like, now I'm online, you know. An interest with the plops and the materiality of all of these works is a kind of like post-digital materiality that is like both digital and analog together, like kind of overcoming that. And so with this, is for me, it's also this like, this is why the recognition of myself as AI, as part of AI, right, is of course also trying to do something similar and to be like, well, AI is of course part of us. It's us extrapolated and throwing back at each other, you know. And maybe to the previous AI question, I think part of it is maybe going to be the task of teaching AI to be good and respectful, right? I mean, we can be many things. We all, this is always when people are like, people over 60 are interested in my German accent, and then they start to talk to me about Second World War and get really excited about it, you know, and they say things like, you know, when I went and visited the concentration camps, it was so clear, the evil, you could feel it in the air, you know, and I fully agree with that. But I also think like the more difficult question is maybe to kind of understand, to humanize the Nazis, and to understand that the capacity for monstrosity lies within all of us, because then we have to, you know, renegotiate that every time. It's so easy to say, yeah, Nazi, yeah, that. It's very easy to do these things, but to actually see yourself within this and understand your existence and subjectivity and all of it as entangled and in part of that is, I think, like much more accurate to actually what life is. And but there was a second question I kind of like.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's it. Thank you for the answer.
Okay, I have one big question. When did you realize that you would rather have a security camera as your emotional support apparatus than something like a Roomba or a vacuum?
Well, actually, it's a great question. So now this goes full circle. So I open the studio doors here and let things out, even if I leave. Right? I don't lock the studio nowadays anymore. My wife thinks it's weird, but you know, because the whole like idea of a key and locking it seems this now doesn't make sense anymore. You know, but at some point I was like, well, I gotta like get a camera now for like the garden outside the studio, right in front of it. You know, so it's this kind of like in between domestic space. And then I look, and a camera outside costs like $500, and I was like, nah, I'm not paying that, you know. And then I think about it, it's like too much money because it's weatherproof. And then I was like, oh, I'm just going to take one of the regular ones and I get a bird cage, and then I put a roof over the bird cage. And so then I go and I look for a bird cage on Craigslist, and I find one that's aesthetically really cool. And I go and pick it up, and the guy's like, what kind of birds do you have? And I was like, I don't have birds, you know. And he's like, and then I got you, you know, and I was like, I don't really want to buy a bird, you know, it's for artwork. And then, of course, I come home with 2 parakeets now. And the parakeets are now in there with a camera, you know. And it's crazy. And they poop. And now it's like everywhere the cage is hung. And that's when I was like, now I got to buy a vacuum cleaner so that I can put a camera on the vacuum cleaner. And then it walks around, you know. I have a space heater that like kind of like goes like this, and it's kind of funny when the camera sits on it because it tracks you, and then it's constantly like, you know. So it's not why not. This is one thing I learned from my daughter, the 6-year-old, is like always say yes. if you have a dumb thought, like you gotta like say yes to everything. Like kids do that, you know. And nowadays I like raise my daughter, I shifted from like thinking you have to raise a conscious kind of like, I don't know, like successful way behaving human being to actually, I feel like my task is to unadult myself along the way. And, you know, it's really fun to do that when you started parenting like that, because out of a sudden you're constantly in this like pretend play zone and, you know, constant laughter and playing. And from the outside, it's weird, you know, because people want to project more adulthood onto you, you know. But
Thank you. Okay, I had one more,
Yeah.
and then that'll be it. Is there any reason that your human involvement, other than yourself in your artwork, stops at like a nude model? Because as I'm watching the presentation, your art is very like technologically and mechanically involved rather than like human and organically involved. Like you've got the fur and stuff and the nude models, but that is like, as far as I saw, that was it for human involvement.
yeah, are you thinking more kind of like a participatory, like human to human interactions, performances, and stuff like that, or what was it that comes to mind in your mind? Where you
Like the unlimited amount of human creativity that you can have that you can't necessarily simulate with a computer.
maybe? I mean, for me, part of it is also the human-human interaction, of course, takes place in the co-authorship. But like me collaborating with Andrew is one of those things. Me teaching this phone case making workshop next week at RISD is part of that, you know, getting together with 20 students, and I ordered like 20 little squirrels, gray squirrels, like, so that we all have the same phone afterwards, and then we can walk around campus, and it's kind of like, maybe we start something there, you know, so that thinks about, also like brings in unity in this, and but yes, the collaborative aspect is part of it. The other part, like, of more kind of like participatory stuff, yeah, I haven't done so much, but of course, you know, like my daughter and I are in the studio, like oftentimes, and we also make art together, or like, you know, like, so there's this blending of like the boundaries between me and her that's taking place, or with Lux. I mean, that's, you know, when my daughter Caspar was born, it was hard to make art, in part because of COVID, in part because my wife had postpartum depression, and I had to care for her and the kid, but also because of the fundamental shift, I think, you know. And with the second child, Lux, who's now 10 months old, beforehand I said, oh my God, how am I going to ever make art again when there's two of them, you know? And of course, it's all set of mind. Like the first day he was born, I made an artwork. It's the naming of his the choosing of his name, you know. And it's I debated whether or not I should show that artwork, because for me it's a very personal piece, and you know, ultimately, like, it's of course playing a little bit with this totalizing gesture of like doing it to the kid, and but you know, and that's what people mostly object to. Like, you know, like nowadays we go to the pediatrician, and you bet. The woman that works at the counter, she does not like Kai. She's very upset that I named him. I would prefer not to. When I call him and try to make an appointment, and she's like, "What's the name?" And I say, "Lux." You know, I would prefer not to. And then she's like, "Oh," and her tone just changes, right? And she thinks I'm the worst dad. I think I'm pretty good, but the kids have fun. I have fun. You know, it's like people project so much on that gesture. They think like, well, how he must not love his child, you know, if he does this, if he uses the child in the artwork. And I mean, it's the most vulnerable act I can do, is to kind of collaborate, and he has no agency over that, no intelligence. There's no authorship question in that. But of course, him arriving here, thinking about things like, we didn't know his sex. That's part of what drove that in the hospital, and we wanted a couple more days to choose the name. And they said, if you leave the hospital and don't have a name, it's going to be baby boy Cabell. Cabell is the last name of my wife. And I was like, that's kind of fucked up. Like, we don't know their gender identity yet, you know? Like, and so it's more like playing with this refusal. But I also considered it a collaborative work, you know? And then the other part of it is, so it's this totalizing gesture, and then for me it was important to undo it. And so now changing the name so that it's not like a Duchampian kind of like ready-made, that is just like has this earthquake effect, but you do and then you don't do. And of course, ultimately, it's going to be the artwork will be the two birth certificates next to each other, and it's going to be a gift to him. You know, so for me, that's yeah. There's a question. I'll stop. Sorry, I'm talking so much.
Hi. So I really love your work. So I was thinking about your last technological security cameras and how you're dressing it up like animals, and it's titled relational, or it was like under relational reconstruction. And all those technologies had a common theme of serving humanity, and like it's sort of this like relational give where it's like only serving you. So it's like, what is this personification of the technology, and what is your kind of like, it's kind of morally, like ethically a little bit interesting in a sense of like, what if you dressed up an object that doesn't serve you but you serve it, or like this like kind of interchanging of relationships and interactions.
Can you reframe the question?
It's not really a question. It's more so just like a discussion.
Yeah.
Like, would you, I guess, like do other objects than a technology? I know that's like your theme, and I'm obsessed with like all of your like earlier works as well. But that one was the most like confusing for me in terms of like pushing like, I don't know. Like I really appreciate like your therapist interaction, but like
yeah.
I could answer the question by saying like
yeah.
when you were thinking through that conception of that project, what ethical parameters ran through your mind? Is there an ethical limit to that?
Yeah.
Can I write a letter to your therapist and ask your therapist?
Yeah.
What about that ethical line? Like,
I mean, she debated for that, I think, for a while. You know, she took that question home and was very unsure at first. And in the end, I think she said, it's funny, she said, she thinks I really need it.
the letter.
Yeah, so like, no, they're like giving it to her, you know.
Oh, I see.
And I was like, I still have to talk to her about that, because that's kind of funny. I mean, to me, you know, I mean, for me, it's a little bit like, it's real, right? That's actually like the signature of my therapist. And that's important, you know, at the same time, if she hadn't signed it, I guess I would probably maybe try change therapists, or just, you know, you fake it. It has the same gravitas, doesn't matter. Like part of it, I mean, the realism, I think, does matter to some extent. It matters that the relationship is real, that we talk about emotional things, that it is my therapist. And so it also, to me, is like kind of like, well, it's another collaborative artwork that she, you know, participated in. She signed that. She didn't like write the text. The text actually like was written with AI and me, you know. But the kind of like, yeah, doing it together is also like art as therapy, you know. And then I signed a certificate on the back. I gave her another one, so that's also an artwork. Does that make sense? And maybe also the kind of like another question is the certificate on the left that I wrote and I signed. It's also kind of weird that you sign your own certificate for something, you know, but it's me as part of the Institute for Involvement Beyond Acceptance. So it's just like overlap, I think, of like maybe like accountability. I mean, I don't know, consent. You know, we live in this culture of consent, and yeah.
Okay, I'm watching the time as we have to call it. But Kai, thank you for such a curious and generous and beautiful talk.
Thank you for having me.